just ask you to, if you can start off by telling us about your childhood and your parents, where you grew up.
Well, I grew up for the first 3 years on a farm. And my father started out being a farmer, but in the teens someplace, and I don't have an exact year, they formed a nonpartisan league party in North Dakota. And in 1920, they wanted to run a complete county office, run somebody for every office in the county. And a gentleman by the name of A.C. Townley came out to the farm to see my father and asked him to run for county clerk of county and district court. And he said, now you don't have to worry, you just go on farming. We'll get your petition signed, we'll pay the filing fee, and all we have to do is use your name. Well, he did lose the primary, but he was elected in the fall. And the banker had told him that he couldn't run for office because he was a farmer and the bank had the mortgage on the farm. But anyway, by accident, he got elected and ended up serving in Benson County, North Dakota, 44 years. First as clerk of court, then as county auditor, and then as county judge. And the county, well, I guess I'm getting a little ahead of my story. In the fall of 1923, the bank told my father that if he sold the crop in the bank's name, they'd extend the mortgage on the farm. Well, those were the days that you shook hands. You didn't write anything down, which was a mistake, of course. He sold the crop in the bank's name and the bank foreclosed. So he was out of the farming business, but he'd been in office 3 years, and so he moved to town and as I say, served the county for 44 years. And the reason I think that he could stay elected all those years, he ran every 2 years, of course, was that he worked for farmers, farm organizations, his entire life, and felt that the farmer was the low man on the totem pole and he needed all the help he could get. And in the early days, my dad in the spring of 1926 bought a 1924 Ford. It was a Tin Lizzie, they used to call it. And North Dakota was one place that they smuggled liquor out of Canada. And so they would go up in somebody's cornfield and hide the car and walk along the border to catch these guys coming across with the Canadian liquor that they weren't paying any taxes on. As far as they had a Farm Holiday Association too, and the Farm Holiday Association was keeping farms for farmers. When the bank would foreclose on a farmer, they wouldn't let anybody at the sale except the guy that lived there. And he'd buy his farm back at less than because the value of farms was down, and so he would buy his farm back with nobody to bid against him. And of course somebody would go off to get the sheriff, but by the time the sheriff came, the Farm Holiday group would be gone and the farm would be back in the farmer's hands. It was probably illegal, but then what do you do about it? Well, as I say, we moved to town then in 1923 when I was 3 years old. My oldest sister was born on the farm, and my second sister was born on the farm. I was born in 1920 in the hospital in Devil's Lake, and the reason was, where my sisters were born at home, the doctor said that my mother wouldn't be able to get my father out of the field in time to ride a horse the 7 miles to his office to get and bring him back to get my mother to, or get the doctor there for my mother. So the doctor took my mother to the hospital in Devil's Lake, which was about, I suppose 27, 28 miles from the farm. And I was born October 1st, I say, in 1920 in the hospital in Devil's Lake. My father came over to see us, and they told him that that white lady upstairs with a white baby didn't have an Indian as a father. Well, my father wasn't an Indian, but he had been out working in the fields for several months and was as brown as an Indian. He finally convinced him that he was really the husband of the lady upstairs, and so he got in to see us finally. Well, and then I had one other sister that was born at home in Minnewacan, North Dakota. That was a long answer to your question. That was my beginning.
Okay. And where did you enlist, and what were you doing in
Well, I was working for, I think they called it the Army Ordnance, in the summer of 1942. It was after Pearl Harbor had been attacked. And my father wanted me to finish college, and he said he could keep me out of the Army that long. Well, I didn't want to be kept out of the Army that long. All my friends were gone, and I was, as I say, working down in South Dakota, building ammunition dumps. They would take a hill away and dig a hole and put a vault down there, and then put the hill back, and they'd have a place for ammunition to store. And theoretically anyway, the hill wouldn't look any different from the air than it did before we started. And while I was there, the Alcan Highway contacted me and wanted me to work on the Alcan Highway, but I had to agree to work until the war was over. Well, I didn't want to work till the war was over, and so I turned them down, and I thought I could tell them I didn't have any money to buy clothes for the project, but they said they'd loan me the money, and so that fell on his face. But anyway, I turned them down and came to Detroit to be with my older sister, whose husband was already in the Army, and she was pregnant. So I was going to stay with her until the baby was born, but I ran out of money on the 27th of October, 1942, so I went down and enlisted in the Army. I tried to enlist in the Seabees, but they tested my eyes and decided they didn't want me. But the Army didn't care how you could see, or how well you could see. I was inducted a day or two later down in a woman's garment factory downtown on the river. And it was kind of an interesting, well, we were down there for our physicals, is what we were. And I remember that a man with a wooden leg got through his physical and got into the Army, And who he bought off, I have no idea. But he must have bought somebody off, because if I'd have had a wooden leg, they'd have seen it. But anyway, he got out to, the camp that's between Battle Creek and Kalamazoo, I think, along 94. I can't think of the name of it right now, but that's where we were sent for our uniforms and so forth. And I fell out the first morning for inspection, and the officer said, after breakfast, I want you to go over to the supply room and get a uniform that fits. And I said, well, I can't do that, sir. He said, why not? And I said, they asked me for $50 and I haven't got $50. That's why I went in the Army. I was broke. Within 2 hours, and an officer on each side of me, I was taken to the officers' mess and fed, taken to the supply room where I got 2 uniforms that fit perfectly, shoes that fit perfectly, orders cut, and was on a train to Camp Campbell, Kentucky. It's on the southern border of Kentucky and the northern border of Tennessee. You'd walk down Tennessee Avenue to Kentucky and come back Kentucky Avenue to Tennessee. So anyway, he told me that my life wasn't worth a nickel if I stayed there because I blew their game. Well, I think their game should have been blown, but anyway, they were holding up people coming into the Army by getting $50 for a uniform that fits. Well, so that's how I got to the 12th Armored Division. They'd formed the 12th Armored Division in the middle of September of '42, and this was a month and a half later, approximately. I had enlisted in the Quartermaster Corps, but I got down there and they decided all the work I'd done with engineers in North Dakota that I belonged in the engineers, so I let them sway me and I went to the engineers. I have always thought that maybe that was the best thing that happened to me because I lived through the war. So that's where I came in the Army.
Good. Iron levels okay? Okay. Super. At Camp Campbell, any experiences, description of the camp that you give us?
Well, we went into church at the Methodist Church in Clarksville, Tennessee, my friend Anthony Schufo and I. And after church, a little lady walked up to us and said, "Where are you having dinner?" And we said, "Oh, down the street someplace." She said, "No, you aren't. You're coming with me." So she was the wife of a railroad engineer that had died. Little old lady. And so after that, every Sunday we came into church and she'd take us home and feed us. We'd go out and take the radio out in the backyard and eat out in the backyard, and she had a nice backyard with flowers and trees and what have you, and it was kind of nice. But one day as we walked in her house, they said, "All 12th Armored Men report back to camp immediately." She turned off the radio. She said, "We will not take the radio to the backyard today. We will go out to the backyard and enjoy ourselves." So we stayed there until about 9 o'clock, and of course hadn't been out on the street to go back to camp more than about 2 minutes when the MPs picked us up and gave us a ride back to camp. And as I walked in the office, my boss said, "Boy, I'm glad you weren't here today." And I said, "Why?" He said, "Because you were on orders to leave. And you weren't here, so we had to send somebody else." And unfortunately, the young lad that they sent in my face was killed on the NZO beachhead. But who says I'd have been where he was, if I'd have gone? So I've never let it bother me much. So a rather interesting story happened at Campbell. I had a front tooth broken off playing basketball. I went over a guy's back and landed on my teeth, and a tooth broke off. So I went to the medics or the dentist and got the tooth pulled and had a big hole in my mouth for about 6 months before he started working on it. He said the danger in starting right away is you don't know what size to make things. They shrink or grow or spread or do something, and so you wait about 6 months and then you can have a better shot at it. Well, he worked on that tooth probably another 6 months, and he'd work a half hour, and then we'd go down to the Red Cross and have coffee and donuts, and then we'd go to lunch, and a week later he'd work on it again for a half hour. Well, the day he put the tooth on a gold frame and hooked it to a tooth beside it, and it's still in my mouth. Well, actually it broke once, and after 35 or 40 years in my mouth, and the dentist happened to have some of the old equipment, and he repaired it. But the danger in doing that is that if they leave the gold very thick, your tongue hits it and it changes your speech. And the dentist couldn't understand how he could make that gold so thin. You hold it up to the light and you could see light through it. It was that thin. And the day he put it in my mouth, he asked me if I wanted it cemented in or I wanted to be able to take it out. And I said, well, I didn't want to be able to take it out, so cement it in. He had no more than gotten that tooth in my mouth. And the general came in and pounded the table and said, what happened to the gold I had on the top shelf for my wife? He said, close your mouth and never open it. I had the general's wife gold in my mouth. That's why he could work it so well. It was good gold. So anyway, it was, as I say, a very effective tooth. It broke once after about 40 years, and the dentist was able to repair it. We were at Campbell, I don't remember, a year and a half or something like that. And then they sent us to Camp Barkley. And why they sent us to Barkley, I have no idea. We'd clean the barracks Friday night for Saturday inspection. The only white place on your bunk would be where you were laying on the bunk sleeping. The rest of it would be sand. There was very little vegetation around Abilene, and the tanks tore up what was there. And we had nothing but sand blowing. I had a girlfriend out in Portland, Oregon that had gone out there after she finished college in Jamestown, North Dakota, where we had gone to school. And I wanted to go see her, so I got a furlough, but I hated to wear my Army shoes out, and so I went into the ration board in Abilene and convinced them that I should have a permission to buy a pair of civilian shoes. So they agreed with me. I don't know why, but they did. And so I went in town or downtown and got the shoes and went out to Portland, Oregon. It was kind of an interesting trip. They held up our furloughs until the train had left. And why the Army would do that, I have no idea. But anyway, I went out on the road to hitchhike. And the traveling salesman picked me up, and I told him my story, and he said, hang on, we'll catch that train in Denver. And off we went. Well, we pulled into the station as the Portland Rose pulled out. I was that close to being on it. Well, he says, don't worry. He took me down to the hotel, introduced me to the manager of the hotel, and said, this young soldier is going to stay in my room tonight. I won't be here. And I want him to put everything on my account. Whatever he eats, whatever he drinks, goes on my account. So, people did those things in those days. So anyway, the next day I wandered around Denver, and my brother-in-law had said it was hard to buy liquor out in Portland because it was rationed. So I bought 3 or 4 quarts of liquor for him and put it in my suitcase. Well, was getting on the train, and they were inspecting your baggage. So I quickly got out of line and checked the bag through, and they didn't care what you had in your bag if you checked it through, but they didn't want the liquor on the train. And they knew we had it, they just didn't want it on the train. So anyway, I finally got out to Portland. My gal friend was working, well, she had a chemistry degree from Jamestown College, and she was working for a man that tested oil tanks, tanks of oil, for various reasons. Maybe it was for roads, and maybe it was for something else. I don't know what it was completely. But she used to say he'd come back wet, and, well, he tested drugs too. Grab a handful of vitamin C and swallow them, and that kept him healthy. And I don't know if I found out that vitamin C is that important, but anyway, that's what he used to do. So I hadn't been there more than a couple of days when I got a message to come back to camp. The division was on alert. And I stayed 2 or 3 more days and decided I better get back to camp, and walked in, and they said, what are you doing here? And I said, well, you told me I better come back. And they said, you didn't get the second wire? Nope, I didn't get the second wire. They wired me that the alert was off, so stay for my furlough. Well, I didn't get the second wire, so I was back in camp. But anyway, I played all the angles when I was on furlough. I was on furlough out in North Dakota one spring when a bridge washed out and the train was held up. Well, the bridge that washed out was between Bismarck and Mandan, and I was in Jamestown, 100 miles east of the washed out bridge. But anyway, I wired the division that I was held up by the washed out bridge, and eventually the train would go. So I stayed 2 or 3 days over my furlough and finally went back to camp, and they always believed me. My fabrications. I've often said that I didn't mind serving once, but I didn't want to do it again. One round was enough. And some of the guys stayed in the Army and fought in Korea and Vietnam and so forth, but I'd had enough. When the war was over, I was sent into Paris to work for General Robert B. Lovett. He was the theater adjutant general of Paris. And I went in about the 1st of June, and sometime in October, they came down to Paris from Berlin looking for people to hire. And if you had a job, you could get out of the Army. I had 65 points, enough to get out of the Army, but I didn't have enough to get a boat home. So I was discharged at the Seine Separation Center in Paris and went to Berlin and worked for 7 months there and then came home. My job in the civilian end of the military personnel in Berlin was to hire teachers for the kids that were in Berlin. And if you had children in the family, you could not get a job in Berlin. And that's why they were looking for servicemen that were not married and so forth. We would have cable parties on Friday, and General Clay would be there, and my boss, whose name I've forgotten, would be at these cable parties, and Washington would tell us who was coming, and then we would go down our list and tell them who to contact to hire. And my gal friend was back from Honolulu, where she taught during the war, and I gave them her name to come teach in Berlin. If you got married in Berlin, they would give you housing. But if you had children, they would have you out of there before they got in school. Well, about the same time, I got a letter from my father's doctor that said he wasn't going to get well till I came home. So I cabled my girlfriend to stay in the USA, turn down the job, and I'd be home. We were about 2 days out of Bremerhaven when 2 GIs got sick. So they flew a helicopter out and landed it on the deck of the ship and took these 2 guys back to Bremerhaven to the hospital and quarantined the ship. We got into New York on July 1st, but our quarantine wasn't up till July 3rd. So we sat in the harbor at New York for 2 days waiting for the quarantine to be over. So I finally got off of the boat late July 3rd. Woke up to the fact that I didn't have any money. All I had was German occupation marks, which weren't very good in New York. But I went to the port. Where I was a civilian, I was going back through the Army system because I had money in Social Security that I needed, or soldier savings, I mean. And they had a CQ there. He was the only guy there because everybody else was off getting ready for celebrating the 4th of July. But he had a little money. And so he loaned me some money, and he knew that I'd be back because I had someplace between $3,000 and $4,000 coming, and he wasn't worried about what he loaned me. So I had a friend in Liberty, New York, Dick Poley, and he owned the shoe store in Liberty, New York. And so I went down to the bus and no tickets. Well, I got to get to Liberty. What do I do about it? So they said, well, we'll take you out in the garage, and the bus that comes in and stops by you will not say Liberty, because they put fake names on the buses in those days because people would storm the buses. And so I don't remember exactly what, but they put small towns on the marquee so there wouldn't be anybody going there, or wouldn't be apt to be anyway. So I got on, and he says, this ticket says Liberty. And I said, well, all I know is the traffic manager told me to get on your bus. Sit down. So I got to Liberty. My friend was engaged to a girl from a family of 7 girls. And so I got a date with one of the other girls, and we were in a bar in Liberty, New York, and this was the weekend after the 4th of July, and I don't remember how many days it was. But they decided I ought to call Bea out in Portland and tell her I was home. So I went to the phone in this bar with everybody shouting and playing pool and what have you, and didn't get her, but I got her brother-in-law, and he told me the story that I didn't know at that point, that my father had convinced Bea that she should quit a job she'd had for a month in Portland, Oregon, and take the train to North Dakota to drive he and Mother coming back to meet me coming back from Europe. I had a sister. This sister was still in Detroit, and this is where they were coming. So I knew nothing about this, and I stayed a couple more days, and by this time it was about the 8th or 9th of July. And this would be 1946. So I decided I better call my sister and see if they were there, and they were there, and I talked to Bea. And I went down to get the bus, and the same problem, no tickets, but I got into New York and by hook or crook, and got back to the port of embarkation and paid off the guy that loaned me some money and got the rest of my money, and went down to the train to go from New York to Detroit. And the through train had already gone, but they had a so-called milk train, the local, that stopped at every podunk town on the way going from New York overnight. It left about 9 o'clock and got into, no, it left about 11 o'clock. Got into Detroit about 9 the next morning. So I went and found a phone and called my sister again to tell her what train I'd be on. It was kind of interesting because they didn't have a cook car on the train, but the brakeman, or the train official anyway, whatever he was, would come down the aisle with a menu for a town down the road, and you'd pick out what you wanted to eat, and they'd wire it ahead to this town, and when you'd get to the town, the restaurant gals would get on the train and serve you and collect for the meal, and that's the way you got food on the train. And I don't know if they still do that, but anyway, they did it in 1946. So I finally got to Detroit on the 10th of July, and my gal and I decided that we ought to be able to get married in a month, so we'd get married the 10th of August of 46, which we did. It didn't make any sense to go to the town she grew up, which was Portland. No, not Portland, Powers Lake, North Dakota, because her mother and father had died by this time. And it didn't make much sense to go to my town, so we went back to our college and got one of the instructors that was a congregational minister to marry us in Jamestown, North Dakota, August 10th of 1946. As I say, Bea's parents had both died, and they had her mother's dishes and linens and things stored in Powers Lake. And we went up there to take this stuff with us out to Portland, where Bea and her sister split it up. Stayed, I don't know how long, but anyway, eventually came back, and I went back and finished school at Jamestown College. The University of Detroit was advertising that if you were a veteran, they'd find room for you at their school. So I came to the University of North Dakota, or University of Detroit, to get a master's degree in the fall of 1947. We had spent the summer with my folks in Minnewaca, North Dakota. And finally got it by taking just a few courses and working at the same time. In 1952, I finally got it. Well, I didn't know what I was going to do after I got it, but I had a decent job, and we had a house by this time, and we had a daughter by this time, and so that's how we got to Detroit, Michigan area and stayed there. And I worked 38 and a half years for the Chevrolet Motor Company. She worked, and I don't remember how long now, but it was probably about 4 years, for Ethel Corporation in Detroit, and then went home to raise kids and keep house.
Well, let me ask you to, let's see, well, let's back up and talk about a few things, and then we'll talk about your experience in Europe.
Oh, in Europe.
Like, what about, before we do that, is there anything about the Tennessee maneuvers?
Well,
what did the engineering groups do here?
Well, on maneuvers, I had kind of an interesting experience. We would have tactical problems that, and fake battles. And somehow I ended up in the half track that was getting these messages from, I don't remember where the messages were coming from, but anyway, I accidentally found the code of these messages, and we won the war because I accidentally found this code, and it was a pure accident. And so they wanted to make me a radio person because I was so good at breaking codes. Well, fortunately, I convinced them that it was an accident, and I didn't have to listen to the dots and dashes forever. I grew up having pneumonia. And the first time I had it, I was working for the North Dakota Highway Department I worked for the North Dakota Highway Department summers when I was in college. And it was probably about 1940, 39 or 40 was the first time I had pneumonia. And they had what they called a 3-day sulfa pneumonia treatment in those days. Well, they gave it to me 3 straight times, and it didn't break my fever of 105. So my mother called the doctor again, and he called the ambulance from Devil's Lake, which was about 20 miles away, and they were going to take me to the hospital. But before the ambulance got there and before the doctor drove 7 miles, my what's the word I want? My temperature broke. And so I ended up not going to the hospital. The next time I had pneumonia was on Tennessee maneuvers. So I don't remember exactly what happened, but they put me in something, and I don't remember what we had in those days. But anyway, I was out of business on those maneuvers because I had pneumonia. Well, I got over that. The next time I had pneumonia is when I was in Paris. And I lived through that. And the fourth time I had pneumonia, I was working for Chevrolet. And I'd feel good, so I'd go into work, and then I'd be sick. And that lasted 6 weeks. And when I finally thought I was well enough to go to work, I went in and the boss said, "Sit down in my office. And if you're still there at noon, you can go out and go to work." So I made it that time. And my doctor told me if I wanted to live, stop having pneumonia. So I stopped having pneumonia.
Okay. And, so let's see. We talked about Camp Barkley. If you can talk maybe the train ride up to Shanks and then on from there.
Well, you know, I don't even remember the train ride to Barkley. I was glad we were going west and not east, because if we're going to Barkley, that means we're going to do some more training before we go overseas, which I was kind of happy about. I wasn't really looking forward to going overseas. It must have been in the fall of '44 that we went to Barkley. And as I said, Barkley was nothing but sand. We had it in our mouth, in our ears. It was decent training. I remember one tactical problem we had at Barkley. They took us out 50 miles at midnight and told us they'd feed us when we got back to camp, 50 miles. And they had gone to the restaurants in that 50 miles and told the people not to feed us. But we had gone to the restaurants before this, knowing this 50-mile was coming up, and paid them for meals where they fed us out the back window or the back door, and nobody could understand why we weren't hungry after we'd walked 50 miles. But we weren't hungry because we'd eaten about 3 meals during that time. So anyway, no feedback didn't work that time. We did a lot of walking in Barkley. We didn't do an awful lot. We marched in Camp Campbell, but we walked long distances. We had several 25-mile hikes in Barkley. I remember one hike, 25 miles, the company commander of Company A, Captain Arundel Cotter, reported to the colonel that Colonel Holdham, or Colonel, it wasn't Holdham, he was the second one, Colonel Graham, that he went through all the barracks and knew the name of every man that didn't go on the hike. And the colonel said, "Well, we'll send those guys on the hike tomorrow and you'll lead them." So the captain made his 25-mile hike too. Down in Barkley, I was on orders to be transferred to battalion headquarters. And the reason they wanted me in battalion headquarters was that they shook out their cards and I came out as a stenographer. Well, I wasn't a stenographer, but I had the rating in the engineers because we didn't have a stenographer, and so they gave me the rating. And the general was looking for a stenographer, and so he put me on orders to go to battalion headquarters. And so I went to see the colonel, and he said, well, forget it, I'll take care of it. And I never heard any more about going to battalion headquarters. When we went from Barclay to Camp Shanks, New York, it was a long train ride. I don't remember exactly how long, but I do remember we had a couple of guys on our train that could see their house when we would stop. First, we'd stop and get on the sidetrack every time a supply train would come along or something like that. That's one reason that it took us so long, that we were sitting by the side of the track a good share of the time. These guys could see their house, but they didn't dare get off the train for fear the train would leave. I remember that. We got to Shanks, well, it was in the fall of 45, it must have been. 44, fall of 44. I guess it was fall of 44. We weren't there long, but we went to a lot of training films, and I was fortunate enough to be on a Navy ship. Don't remember the name of it. Tasker H. Bliss. I don't remember if that was coming or going. But anyway, on a Navy ship, you got 3 meals a day, but on the Army ships, you only got 2 meals a day. So we were fortunate. Now, lunch was probably a bowl of soup and an apple or an orange, but anyway, it was something to do. Time on board ship is pretty long. The Germans chased us from New York to Africa, the submarines. And we sunk so many submarines that they never had a U-boat drive after we went over. But they blew me out of bed one night, and I got a bad right shoulder because that's where I landed. They were dropping so-called ash cans, but the depth charges at these submarines. We got into England several days late because we'd gone by the way of Africa. And they took us to a tent city, the name of which I have forgotten. But I had one of the best meals I'd ever had in the Army. We had steak and all the trimmings. And after they fed us, they wanted to know when we wanted to be dropped. We were in a paratrooper camp, but we weren't paratroopers. So anyway, a day or two later, they sent us to Tidworth Barracks, which is outside of Salisbury, England. There were 27 of us in a room there, and we had a little bucket of coal about like that to keep warm every day, and we didn't keep very warm. So the English had a warehouse full of wool blankets at Tidworth, and it was a long, narrow building with no windows in it. And so when we timed the guards to be at the ends of the building, and then we would go in and get some wool blankets, and then we would time when they'd be on the ends again, and it all worked. We were fortunate they were walking the same speed. And I went over to Europe with 3 English wool blankets sewn inside of my sleeping bag, so I didn't freeze.
Let's see, what kind of vehicle did you go over on? Remember how you got to, did y'all come in at Lahore?
Oh, we were, Patton called us Johnny-come-latelys. We were the first convoy down the Seine River in Germany and France, or France. I guess the Seine River is in France, isn't it? I think it is. But anyway, it was rather interesting because the Frenchmen had sat up in the hills and watched the Germans mine the river. And we got this 16 or 17 boat convoy down the Seine River without setting out a mine. And the Germans never figured out how we did it because this Seine winds all over. Well, the Frenchmen could only see what the Germans were doing to the next bend in the river. So we'd pick up the first guy, and when we'd get to the next bend, we'd take him to shore and pick up the guy that knew the next section. And we went down the Seine that way, and we never set off a German mine, and they never ever figured out how we did it.
And that's when you went over to...
That's when we went over to Europe, the continent. And this was in... Well, we had landed in England October 1st. So this must have been November. We were in England about a month or 5 weeks. It was sometime in November that we went. I remember the first Thanksgiving, we were off the ship, and it was raining, and we were trying to eat Thanksgiving dinner with rain falling on it. As I say, they assigned us to Patton, and he didn't want us because Patton had been coming up from Africa. And as they say, he called us Johnny-come-latelys, made us take the identification off our vehicles, the 12th Armored Division, and called us the Mystery Division, and didn't tell any of the reporters about us. We were had no official records in Germany in World War II because we were the Mystery Division. And that's one reason that it took us so long to get the 5 points for each battle we were in. Because there was nothing recorded on us. We had to do this, make all this record after the war. And Blood and Guts Patton, he was killed after the war in a traffic accident in Germany. And it was rather ironic after he'd come all the way from Africa to Berlin and then be killed there in a traffic accident.
What was the feeling of you and your companions about that?
Well, we didn't have much contact with Patton except rumor. I think he was a good general as far as that's concerned. Some people thought that he didn't care much for his people. He didn't care whether they got shot or lived. I don't really know that. I wasn't that close to him. There were lots of rumors about him, however. During the Battle of the Bulge, which was about Christmas time of 44, we had not been there terribly long, less than 2 months, and so they pulled the units of the 7th Army out for the Battle of the Bulge and spread our 12th Armored Division along the front of the whole 7th Army before it had gone northeast to for the Battle of the Bulge. And that's where we got pretty beat up, actually. We lost about half of our 12th Armored Division at Herlesheim. And by this time there were more units there, and they pulled us back to recruit and build up our strength again.
What did you guys do at Herlesheim?
Well, I was actually in rear echelon most of the time. The only time I wasn't was when we were put up on the 7th Army front. And there, the Germans were over the hill where we were, and we just had these little entrenching tools to dig at foxholes. We weren't a infantry outfit, we were a bridge outfit. And fortunately, the Texas 100th Infantry came and relieved us that night. And they came in with their big shovels and their pickaxes and really dug foxholes. So the Germans came over the hill expecting to find the engineers there, and instead they found the Texas 100th Infantry, and the infantry took care of the Germans. So we were pretty close to getting shot at and probably killed on that little shenanigan. There's nothing nice about war. I remember one night we billeted in a factory in Germany. There was a table in this factory, and I was one of the first ones in, and so I got the table. But I found out later the table was marble. If you've never slept on marble, you ought to try it sometime. Cold, I about froze to death. But there wasn't anybody in my way.
Well, where did you guys, did you help on the building of bridges, or were you?
No, as I say, I was in rear echelon. Actually, what I was doing was keeping the officers' records. And so they took pretty good care of me, because all you had to do is reverse a couple of letters in their name and they wouldn't get paid that month.
I see. So they treated you pretty well.
Yeah, they treated me pretty well.
Let's see. What did you, so what exact, could you just kind of, did you know any, do you have any information about officers or any knowledge you gained while there?
Well, as I say, Colonel Graham was a real gentleman. He was from the University of Oregon, and his father had built, what's one of those big deals out west? Can't think of the name of it. Well, anyway,
The dam?
yeah, the dam. His father had built this dam, and his son had helped him with it before he landed in the Army. I don't remember what happened to Colonel Graham. He wasn't killed. He later built the subway in Washington, D.C. Went through 7 counties, 5 towns, with never, ever a hitch in that project. He was a real honest gentleman. Colonel Haltom replaced Colonel Graham overseas, and Colonel Haltom had been my boss when he was a captain. But we had we had a Captain Macy from New York that was a real SOB. And he chewed me out one day about, we were told to use in correspondence all Army abbreviations. And the Army abbreviations for bulletin is bull. So I put out bull number such and such, and he chewed me out royally. I should know better than to use an abbreviation on bulletin. I said, you told me to use all Army abbreviations. So I did. And we had quite a row, and after Captain Macy, walked away, the colonel called me and wanted to know what happened. And I told him, and he says, well, don't worry. We're going to send him to Armored Forces School and transfer him after he gets there. So we didn't have Captain Macy's problems anymore.
Interesting.
Most of our officers were real gentlemen. They were good trainers. They were good fighters. As I say, Cotter was probably, of Company A, was probably as bad as any officer in training, but he was one of the best officers in combat.
Who are your buddies?
All dead. The people I knew in battalion headquarters and headquarters company, a lot of those are still alive. But my real friends have all died.
Were these buddies of yours from camp days?
Yeah.
And what were their names?
Well, Dick Poley that I visited died a long, long time ago. Anthony Schufel from New York died a long, long time ago. There was a guy by the name of Dick Murray that I ran around with some, and I don't remember where he was from, but he died a long time ago. Well, as I say, I wasn't really in combat very much. I was in rear echelon. And kind of an interesting story, the lieutenant colonel that ran rear echelon was a finance man. And that's why he had the job he had, I guess. He was running, we turned all the payrolls into him and stuff like that. But he had it in for the engineers, and I never knew why. And he got us out one night at midnight to unload a truck. And we weren't unloading it very long before we discovered this. What we were unloading was liquor. And the next day, they were short 23 cases of liquor. Well, we don't know, the engineers don't know what happened to the other 3 cases. But we do know what happened to the 20. There were German bottles, corks, and wax in this house we were living in. So we put all the liquor in German bottles, corked them and waxed them, and took up the kitchen floor and put the bottles under there. Took the U.S. bottles out to the dumps and broke them after we'd taken the labels off to dry them out to burn them, and burnt the cases. And the next day, the colonel, lieutenant colonel, came to the engineers looking for his liquor. And he knew we had it, but he couldn't find it. 20 cases. And
How long did it take y'all to dispose of that?
all night, with about 12 guys working on it.
One night?
20 cases. And he didn't find the other 3 cases either. I don't know who got them or what they did, but
Well, what do you remember about the day the war was over?
well, I remember one thing. We were in Heidenheim, Germany, I think. Heidenheim? That sounds right. We were walking down the street with one of our medics with us, and somebody shot the top of his medic cross that he had on his uniform. And fortunately missed his heart, and so he lived through it. But we reported this to our boss, and we knew where the shot came from, and so they brought tanks in and leveled the building. And the guy that did the shooting was probably long gone, but and the war was over. It had been over a day or 2 at that point. And so there were those little skirmishes. You occasionally heard of one. I had probably an hour's job a day when the war was over, and one day a month type up a payroll. We hunted in the Fuhrer's game preserve, had deer occasionally. We had a guy in our outfit who had a brother in the meat depot 50 miles down the road, and so we generally had more than our share of meat. We were in convoy to come back to the U.S. to train to go to the Pacific when they dropped the bomb on Hiroshima. That was the first one, I think, wasn't it? And so they turned us around right in the road and sent us back to where we came from. And it was after that that I was sent to Paris.
Anything else you want to add?
I don't think so. As I say, I spent most of the time in the rear echelon doing records. The one time that I was up in the line, we got relieved by the 100th Infantry from Texas. I remember one trip where they sent Dick Poley, who was a truck driver, and myself to find some court-martial forms. We didn't have any, and they were going to court-martial somebody, and I don't remember who or what he did. But we're going down the road with foxholes on each side with Germans in them. Well, we didn't start shooting, and they weren't shooting, so we took a different road back. We got our court-martial forms for the boss. They did court-martial people, and I don't know why. When you would lose equipment in battle, they tried to make you pay for it. But to my knowledge, nobody ever did. And they wouldn't get so shook up about it that they'd take it out of your pay. Yeah, they just give you a hard time about it.
Was there anything? No? That was great. Thanks very much.
Well, you're very welcome